Welcome to another edition of The Walkthrough, your deep dive into the forms and contracts that power your business. I'm Byron King, Chief Legal Counsel for South Carolina Realtors.
And I'm Tiara Pitts, your Ethics and Legal Compliance Counsel for SCR. Today we are taking an in-depth look at the March 2026 update to SCR Form 120, our seller to buyer's broker compensation agreement, and the only compensation agreement that is currently offered through SCR Forms Library.
Before we dive into SCR Form 120, we must begin with a critical reminder regarding antitrust laws. Real estate commissions, fees, and the terms of service are not set by law, nor are they fixed, controlled, or suggested by South Carolina Realtors, any local board, or the MLS.
That's right, Byron. All compensation is strictly a matter of independent negotiation between a broker and their client. In this video, we'll explain how the form functions, how to fill it out, but we will not discuss specific compensation rates or standard fee amounts. To do so would be in violation of antitrust regulations.
Today, we're looking at the March 2026 revision of SCR Form 120, the seller to buyer broker compensation agreement. This form plays a critical role in the updated compensation structure following the removal of broker-to-broker compensation from the listing agreement. Instead of compensation flowing automatically through a listing agreement or MLS offer of compensation, Form 120 allows the seller to negotiate compensation directly with the buyer's broker in a separate written agreement. Of course, this will all be communicated through the listing agent to avoid interfering with existing agency agreements.
A reminder that this form is strictly about compensation. It does not create an agency relationship between the seller and the buyer's broker. Instead, it simply establishes how and when the buyer's broker will be paid by the seller if their buyer successfully purchases the property. Section 1, the parties. Now let's jump right into this form. This first section identifies the parties to the agreement, which is the seller and the buyer's broker. We often get legal hotline questions about who must sign the compensation agreement and whether the buyer can sign this form. Only parties to Form 120 are required to sign. Section 1 specifies the parties to the agreement, which are the seller and the buyer's broker, who would both sign this form.
Section 2, property address. This section identifies the property involved in the transaction. If the property is already listed, it will also identify the listing broker here. This helps clarify which property and transaction this compensation agreement applies to. Section 3, buyer identification. Section 3 identifies the buyer associated with the buyer's brokerage. Notice the language includes affiliates, successors, and assigns. This ensures the compensation agreement still applies if the buyer purchases through an entity or other structure tied to that buyer.
Section 4, term of the agreement. This section establishes the effective term of the agreement. The agreement begins when the last party signs and continues into the specified expiration date or into the completion or termination of the pending transaction involving the buyer and property. This means that if you have a pending transaction and a valid compensation agreement that expires prior to closing, the buyer's agent compensation would still be secured by Form 120. You'll see an important reminder here. Payment will only be made at closing unless otherwise agreed to in writing.
Section 5, buyer's broker compensation. This is the core of the agreement. If the buyer's broker is the procuring cause of the sale during the term of the agreement, the seller agrees to compensate the buyer's broker at closing. This form provides 3 options for specifying the compensation: a specific dollar amount, a percentage of the gross purchase price, or another negotiated structure. As a buyer's agent, you can never receive more compensation than what you have agreed to in your buyer's agency agreement. If the seller is offering less compensation than what was agreed in your buyer agreement, your buyer would be responsible for covering the difference. Please speak with your broker about if the brokerage will seek that compensation from the buyer or lower the compensation on your buyer agency agreement.
It is also important to note the clarification language included in this section. This agreement is a compensation agreement only. The seller acknowledges that no agency relationship is created with the buyer's broker and that the compensation is for the services provided to the buyer. Section 5 also includes an important disclosure. The buyer's broker must inform their buyer of the possibility of being paid by more than one party and must obtain the buyer's written permission to do so. And finally, there is a protection clause stating that if a seller defaults by failing to pay the buyer's broker compensation at closing or prevents closing in violation of the sales contract, the seller remains responsible for paying the agreed upon compensation.
Section 6, Dispute Resolution. If disputes arise under this agreement, the parties must first attempt mediation with a mutually agreed upon mediator. If litigation becomes necessary, the prevailing party may recover reasonable attorney's fees and costs. This clause encourages dispute resolution before escalating to court.
Section 7, Miscellaneous Clauses. The final section contains standard legal provisions governing the agreement. It confirms that the agreement will be construed under South Carolina law and represents the entire agreement between the parties.
It also confirms that any waiver, alteration, or modification must be in writing and signed by the parties, and that electronic signatures are acceptable.
And most importantly, it reiterates that brokerage commissions are not set by law and remain fully negotiable.
Signature section. The agreement must be signed by the seller and the buyer's broker or the authorized buyer broker's authorized associates. Once signed, the agreement acts as an escrow instruction directing the closing attorney to pay the buyer broker compensation at closing, so expect some closing attorneys to request your agency agreements and compensation agreements to know what to pay out to the parties.
That wraps up our walkthrough of Form 120. This agreement provides transparency in how buyer brokers may be compensated when that compensation is negotiated directly with the seller.
With the removal of broker-to-broker compensation from the listing agreements, Form 120 ensures these compensation agreements are clearly documented and separate from agency relationships.
Stay tuned for our next video where we'll break down other key forms in the March 2026 update. We hope that this edition of the walkthrough helps you navigate Form 120 with confidence. Remember, these forms are designed to protect both the consumer and the brokerage, but they only work if they're filled out accurately.
However, we have to issue a very important warning regarding the unauthorized practice of law, or UPL. As a realtor, you're authorized to explain the standard language of these forms and fill in the blanks to reflect the intent of the parties. You're not authorized to draft original legal language, provide legal opinions on title, or give advice on the legal consequences of a breach.
If a client asks you to rewrite a clause or needs a legal interpretation of their rights, you must advise them to consult an attorney. Crossing that line doesn't just put your license at risk, it puts your client at risk too.
If you're unsure where that line is, or if you have questions about how a specific section applies to a unique situation, don't guess. Lean into your broker in charge and call the SCR Legal Hotline at 803-772-5206.
Our team is here to help you Monday through Friday, so make sure also to subscribe to the SCR YouTube channel so you don't miss the rest of our walkthrough series.
For SCR Legal, I'm Byron King.
And I'm Tiara Pitts. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.